try to force him left, you try to force him right, you try to top lock him, you try to hold, you try to be physical with him. I equate it to like this. It was like, and maybe this is how centers feel when they were going against Shaq. He was Shaq of shooting guard.
Reggie Miller built his career on being the NBA's great agitator, the sharpshooter who thrived on noise and confrontation. He lived for rivalries, and for years he embraced the role of villain in arenas across the league. Now, at 59, he's looking back at the players who pushed him the hardest, the battles that tested his edge, and the names he admits he hated most when the game was on the line. It shouldn't be a surprise that first person Reggie Miller hated going against was Michael Jordan.
Black eyes are looking at you and I'm looking right back.
The rivalry between the Bulls and Pacers hit its height in 1998. That Eastern Conference Finals stretched all the way to 7 games, a fight that captured the tension between Reggie Miller and Michael Jordan. For Indiana, it was their best chance at breaking through during Chicago's dynasty. For Reggie, it was the culmination of years of personal battles with Jordan. Their history went back to his rookie season. Miller once made the mistake of chirping at Jordan during a game. Jordan shut him down with a line that became legend: "Don't ever talk trash to Black Jesus." Reggie has retold that story many times, and it set the tone for how he approached every meeting with Jordan after that. Another major flashpoint came in February of 1993. A heated scuffle ended with Miller ejected and Jordan allowed to stay. Reggie never forgot that. He carried the feeling of unfairness with him and used it to sharpen the edge in their rivalry. By the late 1990s, the weight of those moments made every Bulls-Pacers game feel personal. He respected Jordan as the greatest, but he described going against him as exhausting and miserable.
I found a tail on everyone.
Not him.
I could not find a tail.
That 1993 moment reinforced something for Reggie. If he wanted to survive against Jordan, he had to adopt a posture of never backing down. He stopped looking to referees for fairness and leaned into confrontation instead. The Pacers' physical defense and his relentless movement off the ball made things difficult for Chicago, but Jordan always seemed to find the answer. The defining clash came in the 1998 Eastern Finals. Indiana pushed Chicago to Game 7. The Pacers trailed by only a handful of points late, but the Bulls closed out an 88-83 win. Jordan averaged over 31 points in the series, while Miller had big shots of his own, including the dramatic game winner in Game 4. Yet the enduring image was Jordan's confidence going into that deciding game, saying he knew Chicago would win. For Reggie, that attitude left a mark. Their trash talk never stopped. Jordan reminded him of his age or his place in the hierarchy, while Reggie tried to claw back with his own barb. When it was over, Reggie admitted privately that Jordan was the first guy who really took it from us. A raw acknowledgement of how personal the loss felt. In the years since, both men have spoken with respect about the battles. The Bulls went on to finish the Last Dance run, while Indiana was left as the toughest Eastern rival of the dynasty. Reggie calls Jordan the GOAT, but he has also admitted those matchups were personal in a way no others were. He hated playing him, hated how draining it was, and still chased the fight every time. That's why Jordan sits at the very top of his list. From one GOAT to another, let's talk about the duels between Reggie Miller and Kobe Bryant.
Where does Kobe's skill set rank with?
See, he took it to a different level, I think. Kobe was a much better shooter.
Kobe Bryant entered the NBA in 1996, just as Reggie Miller was in his prime with the Indiana Pacers. Their careers overlapped for more than a decade, which meant plenty of battles. By the time the Pacers reached the NBA Finals in 2000, Kobe had already begun to build his reputation as the next great guard. That series changed how Reggie felt about him. Miller later said it was in those finals that his feelings toward Kobe took shape, describing them as a mix of admiration, frustration, and respect. Their relationship was layered. On one hand, Miller openly acknowledged Kobe's skill, his relentless competitiveness, and the way he carried the guard position for an entire generation. On the other hand, those same traits made facing him exhausting. Miller once summed it up simply: "I love him, I hate him, and I respect him." Part of that tension came from the generational storyline. Jordan had just left the stage, and Kobe was taking the mantle as the heir. For a guard like Miller, who had built his career as a scoring threat and a leader in the East, Kobe's rise felt like a challenge to his own legacy. The 2000 Finals became the centerpiece of their rivalry. Indiana pushed the Lakers, but Los Angeles pulled out the series and launched a dynasty. Kobe, even in just his 4th season, played with the confidence of a superstar. For Reggie, that series turned competitive tension into something personal. It wasn't only about who could score more points, it was about whose identity as a star guard would carry forward. Miller has often retold stories from those years, especially on shows like All the Smoke. He recalled a fight with Kobe that started with trash talk about Bryant chasing stats. The idea that Kobe was getting numbers hit a nerve for Miller, and it escalated from words to physical confrontation. For Reggie, Kobe's willingness to go after every basket, every possession, made him respect the drive while also hating the experience of standing in the way of it.
He was almost like MJ on steroids.
Over time, Reggie's tone toward Kobe softened. He came to appreciate not just the talent, but the sheer endurance it took to maintain that level of excellence year after year. Yet, when he spoke about players he hated playing against, Kobe's name always came up. That hate came from being forced to measure himself against someone who was younger, just as competitive, and ready to claim the space Reggie had fought to hold. In hindsight, Miller framed those battles as a lesson in legacy. To be remembered among the greats, you had to go through the next wave of talent. Kobe was that wave, and he pushed Reggie harder than almost anyone. That's why Kobe Bryant stands firmly on Reggie's list of the players he hated the most. It wouldn't be a Reggie Miller talk if the Knicks weren't mentioned. Let's discuss how much Reggie hated John Starks.
My favorite was to watch you against Reggie because I hated Reggie the most.
Yeah.
I mean,
everybody did. You're not alone.
The 1990s Eastern Conference had no shortage of rivalries, but few matched the intensity of Pacers versus Knicks. At the center of it were two guards who couldn't have been more different in how they played the game. Reggie Miller, Indiana's sharpshooter and trash talk specialist, thrived on skill, spacing, and mental games. John Starks, New York's fiery guard, was built on toughness, hustle, and raw emotion. He wasn't drafted, he had to fight his way into the league, and that chip on his shoulder made him a perfect fit for the Knicks' identity. Those differences in style made them natural enemies. Miller looked for daylight beyond the arc, while Starks chased him with relentless physical defense. Add in playoff intensity and national TV spotlight, and the rivalry quickly grew into one of the defining storylines of the decade. Their teams met in the postseason 3 years in a row, from 1993 to 1995. And every matchup was fueled by their personal animosity. Starks once admitted he hated playing against Reggie, and Miller never hid that the feeling was mutual.
Reggie was one of those players that he didn't respect you.
The battles turned fierce as early as 1993, when Starks and the Knicks sent Indiana home in the first round. Miller struggled against the Knicks' physical style, and Starks made it a point to wear him down possession by possession. A year later, the rivalry hit national headlines. In Game 5 of the 1994 Eastern Conference Finals, Miller poured in 25 points in the fourth quarter at Madison Square Garden, taunting Spike Lee as Starks tried everything to slow him down. Starks had to live with being the primary defender in what became one of Miller's signature playoff explosions. In 1995, the script flipped again. Game 1 of the Eastern semifinals gave us the famous 8 points in 9 seconds, where Miller buried 2 threes and capped the comeback with free throws. Starks and the Knicks collapsed in real time, and Miller's legend as New York's tormentor grew. Their duels were rarely quiet, double technicals, jawing at each other, and Starks often crossing the line with his temper. Miller seemed to thrive on that chaos, while Starks sometimes let the emotion get the best of him. Over the years, the Knicks had the edge in some matchups, but the rivalry made Miller the face of New York's postseason heartbreak. He became the villain at the Garden, and Starks was often the foil. Both men later acknowledged respect for each other's fight, but those admissions came long after the battles. At the time, the hate was genuine, and that's what made it unforgettable. Miller versus Starks became the shorthand for Pacers-Knicks wars. And for Reggie, John Starks was the opponent who embodied that entire feud. The next player Miller hated was one of the early European stars in the NBA, Dražen Petrović.
There was one dude.
Petrović.
Shit.
Petrović entered the NBA in 1989 with high expectations after dominating in Europe, and it didn't take long for him to show he belonged. By the early 1990s, with the New Jersey Nets, he was averaging more than 20 points per game on elite shooting splits. Fans called him the Mozart of basketball, and his mix of skill and fiery competitiveness made him one of the hardest players to guard. For Reggie Miller, it meant going up against someone who operated in a very similar way. Both relied on constant movement, both could hit tough shots in rhythm, and both wore down defenders by never standing still. In many of their matchups, Miller was the one chasing Petrović off screens, an assignment he later admitted drove him crazy. He respected how relentless Dražen was, but he also said outright that he hated when the Pacers had to see him on the schedule. The setup was clear. Miller was already the established American star, and Petrović was the European guard trying to prove he could belong among the league's elite. When they faced each other, games often turned into showcases of shot-making. Petrović had nights where he dropped 25 points against Indiana, and Miller responded with his own efficient scoring. Every basket carried extra meaning. For Petrovic, it was about respect. For Miller, it was about protecting his place as the top shooter in the conference.
And not only is he giving it off, telling you about it too.
Oh, you talking shit to you?
What?
The duels weren't only about points on the board. Petrovic played with fearless confidence, and he never stopped talking or competing, which clashed with Miller's own trash-talking style. That combination made every possession feel like a fight, even if they weren't throwing punches. Unlike Miller's rivalries with Michael Jordan or John Starks, this one didn't get the chance to reach its peak. Petrovic's death in 1993 ended it just as it was starting to build. That loss stayed with Miller. Petrovic never played long enough to rack up all-star appearances, but he made such an impression that Miller still brings him up decades later. When Miller said Dražen got under his skin, it wasn't about numbers on a box score, it was about how draining it was to defend someone who never stopped moving, who carried himself with total confidence, and who made every game feel like a test of endurance. For Miller, that's what placed Petrovic on his personal most hated list. He was one of the few who could mirror Miller's own approach and make him feel it. When talking about Eastern Conference rivals, Miller always mentions the Pistons. Here's why Reggie disliked Rick Marin more than any other bad boy.
Probably Mahorn.
Rick Mahorn built his reputation as one of the pillars of Detroit's bad boys. His job was never about scoring. By the late 1980s, he was known for punishing screens, hard fouls, and the kind of presence that changed the mood of a game. The Pistons trusted him to make stars uncomfortable, and he did that better than almost anyone. For Reggie Miller, it was a nightmare. His game was about running defenders into exhaustion, curling around screens, and staying in rhythm. Mahorn made sure none of that came easy. Every trip through the lane carried contact. Every off-ball cut ended with a bruise. Miller later admitted he hated playing against Mahorn, which was rare for him to say, since he usually welcomed tough competition. Whenever the Pacers faced Detroit, the matchups turned into street fights more than basketball showcases. The Pistons' plan was simple: force opponents into mistakes by beating them down physically. Mahorn wasn't chasing Miller around the arc to block shots. He was there to make Miller think twice about running the same route twice in a row. A screen set by Mahorn felt like a collision. A rebound battle ended with Miller on the floor. His presence was less about the box score and more about wearing down opponents mentally and physically.
But it was Mahorn, man. Mahorn had a crazy look in his eye.
The Pacers grew visibly frustrated during those years, and Mahorn thrived on that. He didn't need points to affect the game. His contribution came from forcing Miller out of his comfort zone, making Indiana play at Detroit's pace instead of their own. For a finesse shooter like Miller, there was nothing worse than having rhythm stolen away by someone whose only mission was disruption. Mahorn moved on later in his career, but that image never left him. Even when he was away from Detroit, the reputation stuck. He was one of the toughest enforcers of his era. For Miller, Mahorn represented a very specific type of opponent, the kind you didn't circle on the stat sheet, but dreaded seeing because you knew it was going to be a grind. Years later, Miller still mentioned Mahorn as someone he hated facing, proof of how much those encounters stayed with him. Mahorn wasn't a star scorer or highlight name, but he made games ugly, exhausting, and frustrating. That was his role, and he carried it out so well that even decades later, Miller still spoke of the punishment. Let's not forget, Reggie had a rivalry with another Pistons squad, more than a decade after the Bad Boys stopped playing. Let's see why Reggie hated going against Rip Hamilton so much.
You know what I've learned in this game from watching Reggie play ball.
Hamilton arrived in the NBA in 1999, and by the early 2000s, he had become the engine of Detroit's offense. His game was built on constant movement, weaving through screens, and knocking down mid-range jumpers with relentless consistency. For defenders, chasing him was a draining assignment. Reggie Miller immediately saw the connection. Analysts were quick to point out that Hamilton modeled much of his style after Miller, relying on stamina, timing, and catch-and-shoot execution. Reggie even admitted that Rip had studied him closely, but admiration only went so far. For Miller, who had spent years tormenting defenses with that exact formula, it was frustrating to face a younger player who brought the same style and the same energy when his own legs were wearing down. The Pacers and Pistons developed one of the East's fiercest rivalries in the early 2000s. Their games were heavy on defense, physicality, and playoff stakes. For Miller, seeing Hamilton across the floor meant running into a mirror image, one that made every possession a test of endurance. That comparison fueled the tension, and the battles between the two guards became a storyline of their own during that stretch. When Indiana and Detroit clashed, Rip and Reggie were at the center of the chess match. Covering Hamilton meant Miller never got to rest. because Hamilton never stopped moving. The Pistons system thrived on Rip's constant activity, with screens set to free him for clean looks. The Pacers relied on Miller's shooting and savvy, but the burden of chasing Rip often cut into what Reggie could do offensively.
I know it wasn't just tough for me, I know it was tough for him too, because he got to chase me around too.
The rivalry hit its peak during the 2004 Eastern Conference Finals. Detroit took the series in 6 games, with Hamilton averaging more than 23 points. Miller, then in the final years of his career, struggled to keep pace. The narrative coming out of that series was clear. Hamilton looked like the new standard-bearer for the off-ball shooting guard role, and Miller had to accept that the younger player had taken the torch. For a competitor who prided himself on being the original in that mold, the comparison cut deep. Hamilton went on to win a championship in 2004, cementing his place in NBA history. For Miller, that series against Rip marked one of his last significant playoff runs and left a lasting imprint on how he viewed their battles. In later interviews, both players acknowledged the parallels in their games. Rip openly credited Miller as an inspiration, but in head-to-head matchups, it was often Hamilton who came out on top. For Miller, that made Hamilton one of the players he truly hated to guard, not out of personal dislike, but because facing him meant reliving the hardest parts of his own style at a stage when he could no longer match it. And the last person Reggie Miller really hated was another New York Knick, and that man is Charles Smith.
As the teams headed to the locker rooms after the Knicks' 12-point win, Miller tried to get at Smith. He's been fined $5,000.
Smith was a 6'10 forward who spent his prime with the New York Knicks in the middle of the 1990s rivalry with the Pacers. He wasn't a star on the level of Patrick Ewing or Charles Oakley, but his role was clear. Smith's size and toughness gave the Knicks another body to throw at Reggie Miller, and his physical play often turned games into battles of attrition. The Knicks and Pacers met year after year in the postseason, and while the focus was often on marquee names, role players like Smith shaped the tone of those series. Miller never hid the fact that it was the grinders, players who leaned on him, fouled him, and refused to give him space, who made his life miserable. Smith fit that description perfectly. One moment that stuck in NBA history came in 1993, when Smith missed several attempts near the rim against Chicago, a sequence still remembered with ridicule. Miller referenced that moment when reflecting on how Smith became part of his mental file on the Knicks. From then on, whenever they shared the court, Miller seemed intent on returning the embarrassment. Their direct clashes grew heated. Hard fouls led to scrums, and Smith's willingness to switch on to Miller and bump him through screens disrupted the flow Reggie thrived on. In the 1994 and 1995 playoff meetings, the tension only grew. Miller may have stolen the headlines with his clutch shooting, but Smith's presence contributed to the frustration that fueled Reggie's hate for those Knicks teams. Smith never became an all-star, but he earned a permanent place in Knicks lore for his defense, toughness, and playoff scars. For Miller, Smith symbolized everything that defined New York's style: physical punishment, grinding possessions, and constant resistance. That made him one of the opponents Miller genuinely hated facing. Reggie Miller's career was built on rivalries, and players like Charles Smith reminded him how much he despised the Knicks' physical style. Smith may not have been a superstar, but he embodied the kind of matchup Reggie hated most. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and stay tuned for more classic NBA stories.